Critical Thinking Rule 5. Build on substance, not overtone. Rule 5 is about avoiding loaded language in an argument. Loaded language is terms or phrases that convey a negative or positive emotion without constituting a justifying reason. So we should be wary of creating a strict dichotomy between emotions and reasons. Reason, first of all, has different senses or meanings, but the sense we're talking about here is providing a justification for belief, something that helps prove a belief or claim. And oftentimes, beliefs or claims that do count as justifications can trigger emotions, and sometimes that's perfectly fine. But an argument that commits loaded language, which is a fallacy or type of uh, logical problem with an argument, it bypasses actually giving good justifications for the conclusion. Instead, it tries to trigger emotions in the audience, which gets them to believe the conclusion. And this is a problem, logically speaking, because an emotion does not justify a belief or a conclusion. Even if the belief or the conclusion is actually true, and you should believe it based on justifications, not just based on emotions that have been triggered in you. So here's an example. Donald Trump's stance on immigration is the product of racism and a betrayal of everything this country stands for. Now, even if the central claim being made here is true, this sentence still provides loaded language that is not appropriate in a logical argument. Let's identify the loaded language in this sentence. First, we have the term racism. And the fact that this term is loaded in this particular sentence illustrates an important point. What counts as loaded language varies by context. The word racism is not inherently loaded. It can be used to just describe actual beliefs and behaviors and attitudes. Some beliefs, behaviors, attitudes, etc. are racist in the sense that they have racial discrimination behind them. However, the word racism, like many other words, can be used as just an attack against someone. So in this case, if you're just calling someone a racist or saying that a particular policy view is the product of racism without giving additional evidence or information, that can count as loaded language. If there were additional evidence and information given that constitute grounds for regarding a person's view as racist, then it would no longer be loaded. So yes, it is going to vary by context what counts as loaded. Let's look for other instances of loaded language in this one sentence. Look at the word betrayal. Words like betrayal typically function as loaded language. Basically, you're trying to get the audience to believe that the target of your claim, this person, can't be trusted, is a traitor against shared or sacred values. And this gets into a really deep part of human psychology, our need to belong to, identify with, and defend, support, protect groups and society. So if someone is regarded as a traitor to your values, you're going to regard them very negatively. And that's basically how loaded language works. It tries to trigger deep parts of our psychology to raise certain emotions, which can then be redirected against the target of a claim. And these emotions could be negative or positive. Modern psychologists have discovered what's called negativity bias, which means that a negative emotion tends to have a bigger influence over our beliefs, attitudes, judgments than a positive emotion. They can both be important and effective, but negative emotions are more salient. And there's various reasons why this could be. One thing is just in terms of survival. It might be more useful to spend more time paying attention to potential threats, which you would guard negatively, than to potential opportunities, because a threat could kill you, so it has greater overall importance. And so that's why it's more common to see negative loaded language than positive, but both are possible. Let's look at the rest of the sentence to see if there's any more loaded language. The answer is yes, the entire last phrase, everything this country stands for. It's basically just an intensification of the concept of betrayal. That Trump's stance is not just a betrayal of some things this country stands for, but everything. So there's the everything that's intensifying. There's also the phrase this country stands for. So it's basically trying to stimulate the idea of belonging to a country and its core values in the audience and not being under threat. And oftentimes that's a very powerful motivator for people. So the fact that this claim makes a lot of loaded language doesn't prove that it's false. So that's a very important thing to remember about Rule 5. Rule 5 is about stripping a claim of loaded language in order to make the actual logical meaning of the claim more clear, more present. The loaded language might be effective in swaying a crowd or an audience, and that's why it's used so much, for example, in social media and the internet, because it works, sadly. However, the problem with loaded language is that it doesn't actually prove anything. In order to prove something, you need to give a justifying reason. That's what a premise is in an argument. It's a claim that doesn't just trigger an emotion in the audience, but actually gives you grounds for logically believing the conclusion. So that's really what we're aiming for. Let's look at a sample problem. If same-sex marriage is legalized, then sexual perversion and deviance will infect all layers of society. So the goal here is to identify all of the instances of loaded language and to explain why they're loaded. The first is perversion. So this is basically suggesting that same-sex marriage is a bad thing. It's a perversion. It goes against the norm. And perversion is a term that's often loaded. It doesn't have to be if you define it very carefully in a given context. But here, it's just being used as a slur, and no justification is given for it. So it definitely counts as loaded. We also have the word deviance, which is suggesting variation from a norm that's not just an average or a typical outcome, but something that is regarded as normative, that is right. So this also counts as trying to trigger a negative judgment in the audience. And then look at the word infect. Infection and the risk of disease, impurity, or taint is often used in negative loaded language because there's a deep-seated primal fear that people have of contamination, probably related to the need for reacting against potential things that could, poison you or give you disease. So that's a very important part of human psychology that a lot of loaded language will try to tap into. And then look at all layers. This is basically just an intensification. It's an attempt to intensify the fear of infection because it's not just going to infect one layer of society, it's going to infect all layers of society. So in this case, it might be possible to state this claim in a non-loaded way. You would have to radically change it though, because if you look at it, it's almost all just trying to trigger these emotions. So you would really have to reformulate it to make a substantive point about what the consequences of same-sex marriage are in order to try to clean this one up. Let's look at another sample problem. The dirty little secret behind factory farms' profits, namely that there's no good reasons for their monstrously cruel mistreatment of animals, is getting out. Since morally decent people abhor senseless animal cruelty, people everywhere are turning against factory farms. So like the previous examples, there are many cases of loaded language in this one sentence. Let's look for the first one we can find. Dirty little secret. This is suggesting that there's something sinister and hidden, deliberately hidden from the public, behind factory farms. So it's trying to arouse our fear and suspicion. Let's look for the next instance of loaded language. Monstrously cruel. So it's entirely possible that factory farms are cruel to animals. You can give lots of evidence to support that. But this is just basically using this phrase as a slur, monstrously cruel, without giving specific examples. And even if you give specific examples, The word monster or monstrosity or monstrously, those are basically words that are trying to trigger fear of the other. They're trying to trigger strong negative emotions. So most often they can be used as loaded language, especially when they appear in an argument. The next instance of loaded language is morally decent people abhor. This one is more subtle, but it's basically trying to trigger a sense of the audience wanting to identify with morally decent people. It's a type of appeal to the people, an odd populum fallacy in logical terms. We'll talk about this in the series of videos on fallacies, but it's trying to get you to identify not just with all people, the majority, but the morally best people, the morally decent ones. Most people want to think of themselves as decent, and so we want to identify with other morally decent people. Notice though, it's just triggering that need to belong and identify without giving a substantive moral reason. And then look at the phrase senseless animal cruelty. Once again, factory farming does involve a lot of treatment of animals that many people would consider cruel, but does not give any examples in this argument. And it's implying that this cruel treatment is senseless without saying why or giving additional information. So it counts as loaded language. And are there any other instances of loaded language in this argument? Look at the phrase people everywhere. This one is also more subtle. It's an example of what's called bandwagon fallacy, another type of appeal to the people. The idea is you want to identify with the majority or with the increasing numbers of people who are accepting this position on factory farms. But the mere fact that a majority or many people believe something does not give a justifying reason to believe it. So the majority of people can be wrong, they can have false beliefs, it happens all the time. So we really want to be on the lookout for any word or phrase that's just trying to trigger an emotion without giving a specific justifying reason. And keeping in mind that whether a word or phrase counts as loaded can vary based on the context. Some of these loaded terms, if they were in the conclusion of an argument where you gave lots of evidence to prove that factory farms involve cruelty, they would not necessarily be loaded. But when they're just used as a tag, a phrase that you're trying to associate with something as a type of term of abuse, then it counts as loaded. Next up, Rule 6, use consistent terms. This rule is about using the same words to express the same ideas in an argument.